I Want to Believe. Part 1. The Tragic Century. 1. Commentaries on the Infancy of Comrade Posadas. In 1919, the world was near revolution. From the window of his Boero roadhouse, 7-year-old Homero Cristalli, who would one day be called J. Posadas, had a front-row seat. Quote, "There were 2 days in which we couldn't leave," Posadas recalled in his final days, quote, "because the neighborhood was occupied by the firemen, the police, and the army." The unrest had begun earlier that summer with a seemingly routine strike at the nearby Vasena metalworks. Unwilling to negotiate, management brought in replacement labor. The strikers responded by blocking the factory gates and fighting the police, sent to clear a path. Shoving escalated to shooting. 1 cop and 5 workers were killed. A funeral procession through central Buenos Aires turned into a mass demonstration, then a riot when the police once again opened fire. Workers, armed or otherwise, responded throughout the city. Radical and apolitical unions alike issued a call for a general strike. Production halted for days behind streets barricaded with overturned trolleys. Workers raided armories and burned government buildings, shattering an era of social peace under populist President Hipólito Yrigoyen. As the state felt control slipping away, the spirit of the revolutionary workers' movement that had dominated the country a decade prior reawakened in scenes that invoked the words of its anarchist communist forefather, Mikhail Bakunin, quote, "The passion for destruction is a creative passion too," end quote. Their more recent inspiration, however, was the previous year's revolution in Russia. A wave of uprisings had spread from there to Hungary, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Ireland, Finland, Mexico, and Egypt. Workers occupied factories, mutinied against their officers, organized mass strikes, formed workers' councils, and assaulted colonial authorities. Now, Homero watched the workers gather in defiance of police orders. They came first in tens, then hundreds. Men, women, children, Creoles, Italians, Spanish, French, Slavs, Africans, indigenous. Suddenly, it was a single mass, an insurgent crowd, almost entirely unarmed except for a fire in their eyes ignited by the murder of comrades they had never met, whose language they perhaps couldn't even speak. The moment that made it all possible in Russia, Homero's socialist father told him, was the defection of the armed forces to the side of the people. He now believed history to be repeating itself as the police refused their orders to fire. Then he saw new faces, quote, posted in the corners, watching the demonstration. These were sinister armed units sent in to finish the job. Quote, they first shot in the air, and later, against the people. Hundreds were killed throughout the city. 18 of them, Posadas said, right on his street. What could have been called the Argentine Revolution instead descended into a spiral of proto-fascistic violence and state repression, now called the Semana Trágica, Tragic Week, when patriotic hooligans inflamed by conspiracy theories raided Russian, Jewish, and Catalan neighborhoods to drag innocent immigrants from their homes and slaughter them in the street. The violence ultimately led Yrigoyen to settle the Vasena dispute in favor of the workers, using the ensuing calm to arrest nearly 50,000 suspected rioters. Buenos Aires returned to business as usual, but Homero Cristalli was forever changed. Posadas' other childhood memories were far less dramatic. Most were scenes of humiliating poverty. His parents, Emanuel and Elvira Cristalli, were cobblers from Matera, the poorest region of southern Italy. They arrived in Buenos Aires and its fatally cramped conventillo tenements at the turn of the century, quickly becoming militant workers in the anarchist Argentine Regional Workers' Federation, FORA. With at least 7 children, Homero, the middle, they worked their way up from assembling the rubber-soled canvas espadrilles, worn by nearly every worker in the country, to a higher-paying job making boots for the oligarchs, and their own home in Boedo. They left the Fora and joined the Socialist Party, whose distaste for revolution and violent tactics made them a safer choice for many workers. Their modest movement towards the middle class abruptly ended when Elvira died of a heart condition around 1917. Suddenly, the large family was on the verge of starvation. Emmanuel gave the children a box of green bananas to eat for an entire week as he took odd jobs, like peddling snakes at carnivals, or getting beaten for money in cruel exhibitions of old world regional pride reminiscent of the boxing scene in Chaplin's City Lights. Any other nourishment came from begging neighbors for spare eggs. Through it all, Emmanuel insisted that they stay true to working class ethics. In one incident, Posadas recalled stealing 50 cents from his father to see a movie. A few days later, his conscience nagging him, he confessed, quote, "I never stole again. My father taught us to say the truth, to confront the truth. We learned well. It was a matter of socialist pride, as when he told me, 'Never betray a strike.' This was the sentiment of the militant condition." End quote. By the age of 10, Homero found a method of joyous survival amidst the despair. With a group of local kids, he formed a murga, a roving carnival season choir, whose satirical songs about life in proletarian Boedo were rewarded with croissants and cookies. Quote, "We made songs, mostly attacks, complaints, protests, mostly about the trash, because the trash was never taken out, and the people loved it." End quote. Homero developed the propagandist troubadour act into his teens. This was the decade of the Encriolization in Argentina, a cultural renaissance in which children of the immigration wave mixed their various heritages with a bohemian flair that came to define the porteño culture of Buenos Aires. And Boedo's creatives were particularly known for their socialist zeal. Down the street from Homero was the Café El Japonés, where the Boedo literary group developed an assertively left-wing style, opposed to the apolitical Florida literary group's slogan of art for art's sake. In nearby San Nicolas, the French-Argentine folk musician Carlos Gardel combined the sultry rhythms of brothel anterooms and porteño poetics about its lonely johns to create the first tango hits. With the help of his neighbor, minor star of the genre Enrique Santos Discapolo, Homero learned to cover Gardel with half his tragic lyrics converted to supportive verses about local strikes. Everyone who heard it agreed the impression was uncanny. Too poor and restless for formal education, Homero left school after 2 years to pursue a career in the only criollo phenomenon more popular than poetry or tango, soccer. Here, too, was politicization. One team was called the Martires de Chicago, today the Argentine Juniors, in honor of the alleged bomb throwers hanged after the 1886 Haymarket riots, and the Chacarita Juniors were founded by anarchists in a libertarian bookstore on May Day. In later years, Homero would often write that the sport encouraged the sort of teamwork, solidarity, and common exertion necessary to coordinate class struggle. Initially, Cristalli played for his neighborhood team San Lorenzo, before making the cut for Estudiantes La Plata in 1928. It was one of the best teams in the country, containing 5 still legendary players nicknamed Las Profesores. Like the Yankees' Murderers Row, their offensive prowess brought a celebrity aspect to the sport. Regional identities developed at pace with the abilities of the teams. Different neighborhoods of Buenos Aires against one another, and teams from the interior against the best of the capital. Cristalli was an alternate midfielder, a position that defends against oncoming attacks and passes the ball back to the offensive forwards. Although he only appeared on the field in 17 out of 70 games, scoring 3 goals in the 1928 and 1929 seasons, he felt himself to be part of something immense as matches moved from parks to stadiums in front of tens of thousands of fans. To much of the older generation, however, soccer and the tango were dangerous signs of depoliticization. The Fora newspaper La Protesta adopted a strangely socially conservative tone as they noticed youths skipping their Sunday political picnics to play a match or showing up hungover after a long night of dancing, denouncing the sport as, quote, pernicious idiotization through the stamping of a round object. Finally recognizing the big business and mass spectacle of the sport, anarchist players called for a strike before the 1930 season, demanding regulated conditions and a players' union. Their victory meant the end of the amateur era. Larger teams earned enough money from spectators to retain or buy better players, leaving smaller teams and smaller players in the past. The strike was part of a new wave of labor militancy that emerged alongside the international economic depression. Concerned oligarchs responded by installing a harsher disciplinarian in the presidential Casa Rosada, the fascistic General José Félix Urburo, who ousted Irigoyen. After the coup, anarchist players were blacklisted, and the Fora was almost completely driven underground. After 30 years of repression, in which anarchists and their allies received 500,000 years of prison sentences, with 5,000 killed, this was the final knockout blow for Argentine anarchist communism. Many revolutionaries fled to Spain, where the youthful dream of the early 20th century workers to establish a classless and stateless society still seemed possible. Homero, on the other hand, entered his 20s still fantasizing about that big game, the wild crowds, the collective struggle, and the decisive moment on which all efforts are focused, suddenly without a team. End of section.